Experience of non-enlightenment, then we look for a way to narrow that gap and eventually close it completely so that our experience becomes the experience of the enlightened mind. And we may think of that process of closing that gap between where we are and where we want to be as a path to be traveled, or as the journey itself, the journey from here to enlightenment. And there are many ways of talking about that path and of following that path, or of making that journey. You've no doubt come across some of those if you've been around the Buddhist center, even for only a short while. You'll have probably heard of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. You will have heard of the Threefold Path, the path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom, which we're going to hear more about tomorrow. You may have come across the Bodhisattva path and the various permutations of that, the practice of the 6 paramitas or perfections, the development of the 10 bhumis, and so it goes on. There are paths within paths, there are systems of practice. We have within Triratna our system of practice, something which we looked at recently on a Wednesday night class. So there are all of these paths and many others which I haven't mentioned. And they all have their place in the greater scheme of Buddhist practice. Some of them are direct teachings from the Buddha, and others are later developments based on his teaching. Some may be applicable to a particular Buddhist school or movement, and others will have a general application to all practicing Buddhists. So there's no shortage of paths, as it were, or of descriptions of the path would probably be more accurate. There are many descriptions, depending on who we read, depending on which particular tradition we follow, depending on who our teacher is. And Triratna is no different in that respect. We have our ways of approaching the path, ways that Bhante Sangharakshita has laid down for us as from his understanding and teaching of the Dharma. And we have a way of approaching the path, but all of these different paths are leading to the same goal, and they start from the same place, in effect. They start from where we are, and they end up with, or if one can call it an end, with that experience of enlightenment, participating in that experience that the Buddha himself had on the night that he was enlightened. So today, I'd like to just start us off in an exploration of a formulation of the path that you may not have come across before. And I have to admit, we're only going to have time to take a fairly superficial look at this, but hopefully you'll find it useful, even if it's only as a catalyst for further exploration, further consideration beyond this retreat. So we're going to look at what Subhuti has called the myths of the spiritual life. Some of you may have heard of Subhuti. For those of you who haven't, he's a very long-standing order member. He's an influential teacher within the movement in his own right, very close to Sangharakshita. He's worked closely with Sangharakshita. He's written up many of Sangharakshita's later thoughts when Sangharakshita was no longer able to, strong enough or well enough to write directly himself. But from conversations that he had with Subhuti, Subhuti has then developed Sangharakshita's thoughts and put them down on paper for us. As I say, a very influential teacher within the movement. And I think this was back in 2003 or 2004, he produced this paper on the myths of the spiritual life. So it's been around for a while. but has perhaps not been discussed as much as it could have been. So we're going to look at that, and a lot of the material that I'm presenting I've drawn from that, and also from a series of talks at a recent retreat given by two order members from the London Buddhist Centre, Maitreya Bandhu and Dhyana Vacha. And during the break, I'll put up the links so that you can go to that material yourself if you want to explore that further. So, the myths of the spiritual life. And I think to begin with, I'd like to have just a look at this term myth, because I think it can be quite a loaded term for some of us. I remember when I first came across Buddhism, I first started reading about it and then started coming to the centre. I was attracted by what I saw as Buddhism's logical and rational approach to things. You know, that it all seemed nicely set down. You could imagine the Buddhist life a bit like an exercise in project management, that it was, you know, you could take this and you put it in your flow chart, and once this was done, it would lead on to that. And then once that was done, it would lead on to the next bit, and so on. And you just progressively followed these stages through, all very logical, all very sequential, and very amenable to putting on a spreadsheet, shall we say. Had that kind of flavour to it, as far as I could see. Of course, that was because I wanted to see that aspect in it. That's what attracted me. So when I started hearing people talking about myth and legend, and the imagination and the imaginal faculty, whatever that was, I thought, what on earth are they talking about? I had quite a strong reaction, quite a strong aversive reaction to that. I didn't want to hear about that. You know, as far as I was concerned, that wasn't the Buddhism that I wanted to practice. Yeah, I just didn't want to engage at all. And I have to say that for some time I just shut off from that. It was as though, you know, I did what I hope you're not doing now, some of you, which is to just kind of blank it out and turn off when someone started talking about myth. So if that is your reaction to it, firstly, let me say I fully understand. But secondly, I would implore you not to switch off. You know, just try and bear with it for the next half hour or so. You might find that it is beneficial to do so. Yeah, so after a while, I think, you know, there was so much of this talk around me, and so many people were talking about their experiences in terms of myth, that I began to think that maybe I really ought to not just blank it out, but I ought to start engaging with it in some way, start exploring it. Find out what the problem was, firstly. Why did I have a problem with the idea of myth and of story? And I think, well, the problem was, of course, not with myth and story in itself, but within my interpretation of it, of how I understood it. And along with, I guess, many people in our modern Western culture, I saw myth as meaning something that was fictional, something that was not true, something that was meant as entertainment, something for children, in fact. I mean, we even use the terms, don't we, that when someone is speaking a patent falsehood, we say that what they're saying is a myth. We may not call it a lie, perhaps we're too polite, so we call it a myth. Or we debunk people's myths. In other words, we uncover the falseness in them. So yeah, myth has kind of, for me, had acquired those connotations of just something fictional, something that wasn't true. So it took me a while, but I began to see, as I allowed myself to open up to some of these ideas, I began to see myth in a slightly different light, and developed my understanding and feeling for it. Began to see myth as storytelling that had a purpose. You know, I sometimes think that children intuitively understand that They intuitively understand the meaning or the purpose of a story. They may not be able to put it into words even, but they can see the truth behind it. As adults, we tend to forget. We just see the words all too often. All we see is the words, and we don't see the truth behind those words. And there are some truths that cannot be fully expressed literally in words. And this is particularly true of Buddhism. The Buddha himself told us that his Dharma was beyond reason, and that we couldn't hope to grasp it fully with the intellectual mind, that we had to go beyond our reasoning and engage in a different way. And one way of putting across these truths that are beyond rational explanation, beyond words, is to encapsulate them in a story, in a myth. So as I say, you may feel just as I did all those years ago that you're an adult and you don't need myths to understand the truth of things. Well, if that's the case, if that's how you think, I'm afraid I have to tell you that that's just another myth. That all you're engaging in is the myth that you don't need myths. So it gets a bit circular and caught up on itself, but that's the way it works. Now, you may regard yourself as the product of the scientific technological age, a completely rational and logical human being. But underneath that, at a deeper level, we all relate to our lives in terms of myth. We recount our lives to ourselves and others in terms of a story. Now, that may be the story of the valiant hero saving the world from evil. It may be the story of the noble quest to find our Holy Grail. Or it may be the romantic myth of slaying the dragon and rescuing the endangered princess or prince and riding off into the sunset. Now, those are just a few of the myths that we use to tell our story. In ages gone by, of course, the storyteller was a key figure in the life of the tribe. The storyteller would sit around with the tribe of an evening, perhaps, recounting their history through story. The story of heroes, the story of villains, the story of lovers. All of that was a way of us, of the tribe, remembering who they were, where they came from, and giving them a sense of purpose in their existence. Unfortunately, we've moved a long, long way from those kind of tribal groupings, but in some ways we still are the same human being that they were, and we still have this need for telling story. And of course, these days there's a whole industry devoted to retelling these basic myths. But unfortunately, the tribal storyteller these days is more likely to be a film industry tycoon living in Beverly Hills. And the stories we get are manipulated purely for entertainment and profit. Probably says a whole lot about our culture and our society, but that's a different story that's not for today. So, of course, I could use terms other than myth to describe the spiritual life. I could talk about a view or a model as examples, but there are some limitations to these terms. A view can be quite narrow in that it applies to one thing. We speak of a view about a certain thing. We have a view on politics, we have a view on ecology, we have a view on racial diversity, we have a view on gender, and so on and so on. We have many, many views, and those views don't necessarily add up to a coherent whole. They're just specific views on particular topics. And of course, I have my views, you will each have your views, and we'll all differ in our views to some degree or another. Using the term model somehow to me just seems a little bit predictive, a bit lifeless. There's no if I can use the term, no soul in a model. It's a favourite term at the moment, of course, isn't it? That we had all these people modelling the pandemic, and they speak about the predictions of the model and how that's mirrored in what actually happens. It's, to me, model just doesn't quite cut it. It doesn't really capture the feeling of what we're talking about here, which is, after all, the spiritual life. So I'm going to stick with myth, and hopefully you can stick with that as well, because a myth is the story of the whole of our being, and it's also a shared experience. And whilst the myth, whichever myth we're talking about, will have specific meaning that's unique to each and every one of us, it also has a general meaning that applies to all of us, something that we can all share, that we can all engage in. So hopefully this morning we're going to be able to engage in the myth of the spiritual life. But before we get into a little more detail on that, just something to be borne in mind, and that is, of course, that an important aspect of the myth is that it's an approach to important truths. It isn't truth itself. By definition, the myth is trying to draw us closer to something that is inexpressible in conceptual terms. So there is a danger in being too literal-minded in how we take the myth, and that will come out in what I have to say a little further on. But just to be aware of that. Subhuti talks about each myth having a front and a back. And just as a coin has a front and a back, we can't separate them. You can't peel off the back of a coin and just have that. You've got to have the other side as well. And so it is with a myth, that it comes with its front, it's the side we engage with, the side that is beneficial, the side that conveys meaning to us. It also has a back, which is the pitfalls, if you like, that the myth can lead us into if we approach it in too literal a minded way. So we have to be aware of both sides, because if we ignore the back of the myth, we're in danger of falling into it and getting caught in it. So, yeah, something to be borne in mind. And I'll be going through both aspects of these myths of the spiritual life. Well, now, in fact. So let's have a look at them. Now, there are, in fact, three, or Subhuti speaks about three myths. We have the myth of self-development, the myth of self-surrender, and the myth of self-discovery. If you do listen to the talks by Yanavacha and Maitreya Bandhu, they talk of self-transcendence, where Subhuti talks of self-development, and they also add emergence to self-discovery. So I'll just say that now in case you wonder what they're talking about if you do listen to their stuff on Free Buddhist Audio. Okay, thanks, Sthiranāga. So at the beginning, I spoke about Buddhism starting with us realizing the gap that separates us from enlightenment. Now, the particular myth from those three that might be appropriate to us will depend to a large extent on how we see that gap and what we feel is the way for us to bridge it. And we could broadly speak of the spiritual life as a process of I become Buddha, or Buddha becomes me. So just sit with those terms. Those terms I think will become more evident as to what we mean by them as I go through it. So if we look at the first of those two possible positions, I become Buddha. What does that actually mean? It means that as I am now, I am not Buddha. I am not enlightened. But I become Buddha. How? How do I become Buddha? Well, I become Buddha by making an effort to change. Yeah, we know that if we're not already enlightened, we've got to do something to become enlightened. So we make an effort to change ourselves, to become Buddha. And that effort, that exercising of will on our part, is the myth of self-development or self-transcendence. So if we could have the next slide, please, Sthiranāga. So the myth of self-development, and as I said, each myth has a front and a back. So we'll start by looking at the front. What we might call the positive aspects of the myth, although yeah, I think it's perhaps I don't know, I find it easier to think of it in terms of the front and back of the myth rather than the positive and negative. So the front of this myth has certain characteristics, this myth of self-development, self-transcendence. And they're not in any particular order, so don't take these as sequential, I just the order in which they came to me. So that we can say that this approach to this way of regarding the spiritual life, this myth around the spiritual life, is easily approachable. You know, we can understand self-development. That's you know, we're encouraged to develop in all walks of life, aren't we? Not just in the spiritual arena. So we're probably quite familiar with self-development, and we can approach it quite easily. Much as you know, we might want to develop by becoming more healthy, by becoming fitter. So we change our eating patterns, we go to the gym, we exercise more, so on and so forth. So that's a process of self-development that we're probably quite familiar with. We may feel that we want to learn a new skill, so we undertake a training course or we study whatever in order to, as we see it, improve ourselves. So again, a process of self-development. We're very familiar with self-development. It's sort of out there in the culture, isn't it? That if you want something, then you have to grow into it. You have to make effort to change. You have to do something. So the myth of self-development is something that we can understand. It's easily approachable. It can be appealing because it allows us to use our will to change. So it requires personal effort, and that can be appealing to us. We want to feel that we are doing something, that we are making a positive change in our lives. So yeah, it gives us something to do. Generally speaking, we are by nature prone to activity, that we like to do things. The downside is that the things that we do aren't always what's best for us, but at least in terms of self-development and the spiritual life, we're doing something positive. We're doing something that's good for us. This particular myth, this approach, if you like, to the spiritual life, it values conditions for growth. And we can set up those conditions if we know how, if we understand how. It creates structure by its very nature. It's as I said a bit earlier, you know, I could see in my early days, you know, how one could plot this onto a nice flow chart, each stage building up on the previous stage and developing this whole structure of a spiritual life around transforming myself bit by bit. So it creates that structure, and I think we find structure quite comforting, or most of us anyway. Yeah, we like to know where we fit in the structure. We like to know that we have a place, and through this this myth of self-development, we develop a positive hierarchy. Again, as human beings, we seem to have this. This almost innate, I would say, this innate attraction towards a hierarchy. Unfortunately, hierarchies become corrupt quite often, but there is a natural hierarchy, and within Buddhism, there is a natural hierarchy of spiritual development, of spiritual growth. And this particular model embraces that hierarchy, enables that positive hierarchy, so that So, we can see where we are. We can see we've made some progress, and we can see what we need to do to take the next step in the path, as it were. And of course, the myth of self-development emphasizes all the basic teachings. So it emphasizes ethics, it emphasizes friendship and altruism, doing things for the benefit of others. And essentially, of course, it emphasizes karmic responsibility, that we are responsible for our own actions. All of these come under this developmental myth, that we work on these things and we change ourselves. Our ethical practice becomes more skillful the more attention we pay to it. Our friendships become deeper the more engaged we are in them. And that we work on developing and transcending ourselves, our self-interest, our selfishness, by doing things for others and by accepting our responsibility for our actions. It's not up to anyone else, it's down to us. If I've behaved in this particular way, then I must expect the consequences of behaving in that way. And there's no point blaming someone else for what I've done. So there's a lot of front to that myth, I think. But there's also a back, and we'll have a look at the back now. So the back of that myth, some things to watch out for when we're engaged in that myth of self-development. That it can lead us to an attitude of always sacrificing the present for the future. That self-development means that there's always something better to move on to, that we're always striving to be better than we are today. Oh, well, I've been a bit unskillful today, but tomorrow I'll be better. Or meditation practice. I've overslept today, but never mind, I'll get up early tomorrow. Or I'll get up early on the retreat and then I'll get up early every morning after that. So I'm just going to have these last couple of days in bed before the retreat starts. Or we don't engage with what's really going on in the present because we're always striving for being better in the future. Another back to this myth, of course, is that it can turn into something that reinforces our ego. Look at me, look how good I am. I get up without fail every morning and meditate, never miss a day. Doesn't matter how ill I feel. It's that's great. That's a good thing. Doing it is a good thing. Telling yourself how wonderful you are for doing it is probably not such a good thing. So self-development can become a boost to our ego. We can appropriate all aspects of the spiritual life to our ego if we're not careful, and that particularly applies, I think, in this model. It can lead also, of course, to competitiveness and comparison. The Buddha frequently exhorted his followers not to compare themselves as superior or inferior or equal to anyone else. The danger is in making the comparison. It doesn't matter what conclusion you come to from that comparison, it's the making of the comparison. Because in making a comparison, of course, you're setting yourself apart from someone else. Here's me, I'm this way, there's you, you're that way, and we're separate. So there's a danger there in making comparisons and in competitiveness. Again, it can become unhealthy. It can simply become an exercise in trying to be better than someone else and not focusing on actually what we're trying to do is develop ourselves. So it's simply, I want to be better than so-and-so. Oh, so-and-so meditates once a day. Right, I'm going to meditate twice a day. Not because we think meditating twice a day is good for us, but just so we can say, well, I meditate twice a day and you only do it once a day. So there's a danger there in competitiveness. Perhaps the reverse of those last two, of course, is that no matter how much you try, you never feel good enough. It's never quite enough. And you endlessly strive to be better, not recognizing how much progress you may have already made, simply feeling that you're not good enough. You can't do it. You're so special that you can't do it. And it can be a real danger. I'm well aware that I can be prone to this one in particular. If you couple that one with comparisons, then you're can be in a really dark place. Um, and this is one that I have to work hard at not doing. Don't make the comparison, because if you do, you're going to end up feeling despondent. You're going to end up disappointed. You could even end up despairing of ever being able to get anywhere in the spiritual life. So these are the back of this myth, something to be aware of, something to be careful of. So in our system of practice, this myth, the myth of self-development, self-transcendent, is our dominant myth within Triratna, certainly. When we first start to practice, this is how we will be taught, this is how we are taught and how we teach, because it is so fundamentally important, certainly in the early stages of our practice, and those early stages can last many, many years. I still think that for me, this myth is a very important myth and a major part of my practice. We don't abandon, I think, this myth of self-development too early, because we have a long way to go. And this myth manifests within Triratna through our meditation practices, our practice of the precepts, our engagement with Sangha, our study of the Dharma and applying it to our lives. So for most of us, if not all of us, this is the essential myth for leading the spiritual life. But it's not the whole story. It's not the only myth. So we're going to move on now to the other two. If you remember a little while ago, I spoke about that this myth arises from the approach of I become Buddha. And the other approach is that Buddha becomes me. And this is when we see the path more as a process of letting go of effort and surrendering our will, our self-will, to something larger than our limited consciousness. This can be something that we perceive as out there, something other than us, in which case we're engaging with the myth of self-surrender, which we're going to look at now. Or it can be seen as something within us that we let go to, in which case we'll be engaging with the third of the myths of self-discovery, which we'll come on to shortly. So let's have a look at the front of this myth of self-surrender, this myth of letting go into something that we perceive as perhaps beyond us, something out there, something larger than us. I'm trying not to get sort of drawn into any kind of description or attempt at explaining what something out there is, because quite frankly, I can't. And I don't think anyone can, but I think we have to find out for ourselves, what does that mean to us? So let's just leave that there. That may be something you'd like to bring up in your discussion groups. And I hope my fellow group leaders will forgive me that. So on the front of this myth, it doesn't rely on us exercising our will. We don't have to make ourselves do something, which can be helpful. For some of us, we need to let go of our will a bit. We can be too forceful. Again, a trait I'm well aware of in myself. We can be too determined to do it our way. So to have some part of our practice where we let go of that self-willing can be very helpful. It also works to counter ego appropriation. We can't really surrender ourselves to something beyond our own concept of our ego self and still hang on to that ego in quite the same way. It just doesn't work. It can also be a corrective to all those elements that are the back of the myth of self-development. So if you remember some of those items that are the back of the previous myth, that's competitiveness and comparison, or feeling that we're not good enough no matter how hard we try. Well, in this myth, of course, it's not dependent on our trying, and it's not dependent on where we are in relation to other people. It is simply letting go of our sense of self and falling back on something that is beyond ourselves. So it can act as a corrective to that. It also counters the tendency to secularization of Buddhism. So in some ways, I think it's certainly in the West, Buddhism is in danger of becoming secularized. It's in danger of becoming purely a psychology. And it's so much more than that. The spiritual life is not just an exercise in psychology. It is so much more. And this letting go of this focus on me and what I'm doing to improve my mind and develop myself can lead us down a road that takes the heart out of Buddhism, takes all the emotion, takes that real sense of the whole of our being out of Buddhism and just reduces it to a set of self-help practices. So the myth of self-surrender can work to counter that. And it engages our heart. It opens up the whole of our being. There is, of course, a back to this view that we need to be aware of as well. There is a danger with this myth that we don't attach any importance to ethical guidelines. Oh, it doesn't matter what I do because I'm surrendering myself to the Buddha. So we kind of let go of all the benefits of the path of self-development. Is a danger here. There's the danger of literalism. Again, this I think touches on what I said earlier about surrendering to something beyond ourselves, and we can literally interpret that in ways that are not helpful. That we need to hold loosely to that idea of what is it that we are surrendering to, rather than fix it as something definitely out there that we need to find a way of approaching. And there's a danger of exploitation. So again, in the previous myth, we spoke about it enables a positive hierarchy. But unfortunately, not all hierarchies are positive. And even within spiritual groups, we hear stories of groups where someone sets themselves up as some sort of charismatic leader, and their intentions are not good. And they are simply there to exploit people. And if their followers feel that their path is to surrender to the person at the top of the hierarchical structure, then they surrender their will to someone who is just out to exploit them. So we can open ourselves up to that sort of thing if we're not careful. I hasten to add, not, I think, within Triratna. I'm pretty sure that we're very careful not to be exploitative in any way. We have lots of checks and balances, but in general terms, there is a danger there of that. So let's move on to the third myth, which is the myth of self-discovery, which, as I said earlier, is part of this Buddha becomes me approach. But this is where we see the Buddha, or we see enlightenment arising from within us, not being something outside of us that we surrender to. So the front of this myth is that we explore reality through our own direct experience. So it is very experiential. It's about what am I experiencing now? What's going on in my life here and now? Because it relates to our experience here and now, it's also possible to find liberation within that experience. So the myth of self-discovery is the myth of, or the path of uncovering what is what we might perceive as within us, as realizing our full potential here and now, not having to spend decades or lifetimes even steadily trying to improve ourselves, but that just uncovering what is already there, this potential to be enlightened. The myth of self-discovery is very much a try it and see approach. Try it, does it work? Yeah, that it's experiential, that it's us looking at what's happening in our experience and what that is doing So it doesn't, it's not about endlessly striving to get somewhere, to attain something, to make that next incremental step on the path. Now, that's not to say that we don't have to do that, of course. All of these myths are interdependent, they relate to each other, but it's not the main thrust of this myth. And it doesn't ask us to surrender to something that we see as outside of ourselves, more opening up to what is within us. The back of this myth, the potential dangers of this myth, are, first of all, it can lead to moral relativism. In other words, I don't need an external set of ethical guidelines. I don't need ethical principles from outside. I have everything within me. I am already, my true nature is perfect, and therefore whatever I do must be right. So it can undermine ethical practice. It can undermine, in fact, the whole Buddhist path that is the foundation for how we practice, if we approach it too literally and without care. It can lead us to think that there's no need for Sangha because we're just uncovering our already enlightened nature. There's no need for altruistic activity or engagement with the world. It can lead us to see our experience as being beyond challenge. You can't question me. I'm just acting from my enlightened self. So there can be no challenge to what we do. And of course, it can also lead us to claiming spiritual achievements that we may not have. Moral and spiritual laziness is another aspect of the back of this myth. Why make any effort? What can we add to the fact that we're already an enlightened being? So there's nothing to add, so there's nothing to do. And we can also mistake an intellectual understanding for a spiritual experience. Okay, there's quite a lot in there. There's quite a lot of back to this particular myth, and one that we do need to be careful of. So thanks, Sthiranāga. I think we can dispense with those now. So just in a few minutes that I've got left, and I realise that I am rapidly running out of time, just say something about the relationship between these myths. Because they are interdependent and we can see them as being present, all three of them present in our experience of the spiritual life at the same time. It's likely that one will be dominant and the other two more in the background, but they will all be there to some degree. And we need all three of them to be there for a balanced spiritual life. So the back of one myth is balanced out by the front of the other two myths. So the myth of self-development needs to be balanced by the myth of self-surrender, that we must open ourselves up to something altogether beyond us. And also by the myth of self-discovery, the realization that ultimate truth is present in this very moment, is right here under our noses, as it were, and not somewhere else, somewhere out there. The myth of self-surrender needs to be balanced by the myth of self-development, the need for personal moral effort and the exercise of individual responsibility. And it also needs to be balanced by the myth of self-discovery, the awareness that realization is to be found within our own experience, not outside of it. And the myth of self-discovery needs to be balanced by the myth of self-development, the exercise of moral effort through the use of our will, and also by the myth of self-surrender, the giving up of one's ego to something that lies beyond it. So the significance of these myths lies in how we see ourselves in relation to them, because that will then dictate how we approach the practices that we do. So these myths are not practices in themselves, but rather ways of approaching the spiritual life, ways of engaging with our practice. And we can use these myths as a way of finding out where we are in our practice and whether we're practicing in a positive way or whether we're caught up in some aspect of the back of one of the myths. And if we can recognize that, then we can perhaps see how we need to adjust our engagement with the spiritual life. And so close that gap between where we are and where we want to be.